Hi class, this video is about the top stitching. Top stitching is a name for a process, not necessarily for a specific stitch. We use the straight stitch on the machine for top stitching, but it is a treatment, a seam treatment, if you will. The first thing you're going to need to do for this sample is to take two pieces of muslin, side by side on the long side, and sew them at a 1-inch seam. I'm not going to use any pins today. I'm going to use my 1-inch markation on my machine. And I'm going to sew this up real quick. I think I failed to stop top stitch at the beginning of the seam. If that ever happens, here's how you can fix it. Go back in and just line everything up and restitch the beginning of that seam. I'll take a few stitches and I'll backstitch. No one ever has to know. There. Now I have my backstitch seam at beginning and end. Next, you need to take your sample to the iron and press this seam open. Don't forget to use your steam. When you get done pressing it, look at the right side of it and make sure the seam looks nice and there's no folds in the press. Sometimes I like to just go over it from this side once I've got that done. Once you've got that pressed, go back over to your machine. All right, so I'm back at my machine. Top stitching is a decorative, sometimes functional stitch. What it does is basically hold the seams down. And we do it a lot on thicker construction like leather and things. You've definitely seen top stitching. You've seen it on all kinds of things. It's in the flat felled seam that we did last class. It is in the seam of a pair of jeans. If you look right here, that's top stitching. So you can't mark it because it's on the outside of the garment. So what do? Well, I'm about to show you. When you're good enough, you can eyeball it. A lot of times top stitching is going to be 1/4 of an inch away from your seam. And it goes on both sides. So when we top stitch, we'll stitch 1/4 of an inch away from the seam on this side and 1/4 of an inch away from the seam on this side. Now we can lay our ruler on it and look and see how far that is. That's this far. But how do we line that up? Sometimes people use the edge of their presser foot and say you'll line that seam up with the edge of your presser foot here like this. This may be 1/4 inch. Let's double check. I'm gonna lay my 1/4 inch on the seam line. I'm gonna bring my needle down and it looks like it is just a little larger. My needle is not quite coming down here. It's coming a little bit to the right. So what I can do is adjust my needle position till it's in the right place. I think 2 clicks makes it exactly right. So if I top stitch with my seam lined up here on the edge of the presser foot and my needle position moved 2 clicks to this side, it'll be right at 1/4 of an inch. So now that I've got that set up, I'm gonna do this row of top stitching and then I'll set up the other side. One more thing to note, top stitching we do at about a 4 stitch length. We want it a little larger since it is kind of decorative. So top stitching happens at a 4. And I'm lining up my presser foot. The other thing, since top stitching is decorative, we often don't backstitch on it. So for this sample, you will not need to backstitch. I'm lined up and ready to go. Let's see how this goes. I failed to mention, before you top stitch, make sure your seam allowances are all laid flat. That's the main functional purpose of top stitching, is to keep these seams all flat. And how did that go? Let's see. Looks pretty good to me. It's a nice, consistent 1/4 of an inch away. And on the back, except for some machine ugliness, it looks pretty good. Now we need to do the other side because this seam is laid open. I'll take the same approach though. Instead of lining my seam up on this side, I'll line my seam up on this edge of the presser foot, right? See how that's happening? We're lined up right there on the edge. Let's bring that needle down and see how far over it is. This time I'll lay it up here so you can see a little better. Yeah, it's not quite right. We need to change that needle position some more. I'd say 2 clicks to the right of center is right. This looks all set up and good. We're gonna give it a whirl. Remember that stitch length should be at a 4 or so. It can be higher. It doesn't need to be at a 3 though. Whoops, sorry. And there's my top stitch seam. Top stitch 1/4 of an inch away. Top stitching is usually defined by that. Top stitch at 3/8 of an inch from the seam. Top stitch at 1/4 of an inch from the seam. Top stitch at 1/8 of an inch from the seam. You get the picture. But there's our top stitching sample.